Congratulations, Your Majesty. You are with child. The healer's voice was a soft chime in the quiet room, but to Octavia, it sounded like a thunderclap that cleared years of storm clouds. She clutched the small, cooling talisman the old woman had used for the test, her fingers trembling against the smooth stone. For 7 years, her womb had been a silent tomb, a source of shame that fed the jagged whispers of the northern pack. She had been the barren queen, the flaw in Alpha King Lionel's perfect reign. But today, the silence was over. She didn't wait for the healer's formal bow. Octavia swept out of the room, her heavy skirts hissing against the marble floors of the palace. She needed to find Lionel. She pictured his face, the way his icy silver eyes would melt, the way his stoic mask would finally shatter when he realized they were no longer just a crown and a title, but a family. He had always been patient, telling her that he loved her with or without an heir, but she knew the weight he carried. Today, she was lifting it. As she neared the royal wing, the air changed. The familiar scent of cedar and rain that belonged to her husband was thick, but it was laced with something sharp and cloying, the heavy, musk-sweet scent of a female in heat. Octavia's wolf stirred, a low growl vibrating in her chest. The doors to the king's private chambers were slightly ajar. Octavia reached out, her heart hammering a joyful rhythm that she expected the world to join. But as her hand touched the wood, she heard a voice that wasn't Lionel's. It was Lady Emmeline, the woman the council had been pushing as a suitable replacement for years. "It's what the kingdom needs, Lionel," Emmeline purred. "A bloodline that isn't a dead end." Octavia froze. Through the sliver of the open door, the scene destroyed her world in a single heartbeat. Lionel stood by the window, his large hands resting on Emmeline's waist. The woman was draped against him, her head tilted back. "The council is right." Lionel's voice was low, roughened by a tone Octavia recognized as arousal. "I have been fond of Octavia, but fondness does not secure a throne. A king must have an heir, and she simply cannot provide one." The talisman in Octavia's pocket felt like a brand, searing her skin. The joy that had filled her moments ago turned into a cold, black sludge. He hadn't been patient. He had been waiting for an excuse. She didn't scream.
She didn't burst in.
The betrayal was too deep for noise. It required a silence as absolute as the one he had just condemned her to. She backed away, her boots silent on the carpet, and turned into the service corridor where she found her sister, Lori. Seeing Octavia's ghostly face, Lori grabbed her shoulders. "Octavia? What happened?" "He's with her," Octavia whispered, her voice sounding like it was coming from miles away. "He thinks I'm broken. He's already replaced me." She gripped Lori's arm, her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce light. "We have to leave.
Now.
Before he knows." "Leave? To where?" "Anywhere that isn't here," Octavia said, her hand protective over her stomach. "He doesn't get this child. He chose his throne over me. Now he can have it alone." Under the cover of the gathering dusk, the queen who was supposed to be a sacrifice to tradition vanished into the woods, leaving behind a crown and a king who would wake to find his world as empty as he believed his wife to be. The iron-wrought gates of the northern palace groaned open, a sound that felt like the shifting of destiny itself. 7 years had passed since Octavia had last breathed this air, yet as the carriage rolled up the gravel path, the scent of cedar and pine felt like a cold hand tightening around her throat. She wasn't the broken girl who had fled into the night with a shattered heart and a secret growing inside her. She was a woman forged in the fires of exile, and tonight, she was a ghost come back to haunt the living. Beside her, Duke Flemings reached out, his hand steadying hers. "You don't have to do this, Octavia," he murmured, his voice a calm anchor. "We could turn back. The twins are safe with Lori." Octavia straightened her spine, the silk of her crimson gown, the color of spilled blood and rubies, shimmering in the moonlight. "No," she said, her voice like honed steel. "I spent 7 years hiding while he prepared to put my crown on another woman's head. I'm not turning back." The ballroom was a sea of gold and white, a celebration of Alpha King Lionel's engagement to Lady Emmeline. The air was thick with the scent of expensive wine and the low hum of courtly gossip until the herald's staff struck the floor. Announcing Duke Flemings of the Southern Reach, the herald boomed, his voice faltering as he caught sight of the woman on the Duke's arm. And his guest, Lady Octavia. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the polite quiet of a respectful audience. It was the suffocating stillness of a room that had just seen a dead woman walk. The music died mid-note. Heads turned with a collective, violent snap. Octavia stepped onto the mezzanine, her gaze sweeping over the faces she remembered. The ministers who had called her barren, the ladies who had whispered behind their fans. She looked more regal than she ever had as their queen. Her hair was swept up in a defiant crown of braids, and her eyes, once soft with devotion, were now twin chips of frozen amber. At the far end of the hall, standing on the dais beside a smug, shimmering Emmeline, was Lionel. The Alpha King looked as if he had been struck by lightning. The glass in his hand shattered, wine staining the white rug like a fresh wound, but he didn't seem to notice. His silver eyes, usually so controlled, were wide with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a raw, agonizing longing that made Octavia's pulse skip a beat. He looked older, the lines around his mouth deeper, but he was still the man who had occupied her dreams and her nightmares for nearly 3,000 days. Octavia didn't look away. She maintained a mask of cool, aristocratic indifference, her hand resting lightly on the Duke's arm as they began their descent down the grand staircase. Every eye followed her, tracking the sway of her hips and the effortless grace of her stride. She saw Lionel take a step forward, his lips parting as if to speak a name he had long since buried, but Octavia beat him to the silence. She offered the room a sharp, predatory smile, the smile of a woman who held every card in a game the king didn't even know they were playing. She wasn't just back, she was the most powerful person in the room, and the twins, tucked away safely for just a few moments more, were the storm that was about to level his kingdom. The tension in the ballroom was a physical weight, thick enough to stifle the breath of every noble present. Octavia continued her descent, her hand light on Duke Fleming's arm, ignoring the frantic whispers that trailed in her wake like a toxic vapor. She could feel Lionel's gaze, a searing, silver brand that tracked her every movement, demanding answers she wasn't yet ready to give. She reached the final step and paused, the crimson silk of her gown pooling around her feet like a challenge. The crowd parted instinctively, forming a wide, fearful circle. Lionel had ascended from the dais, his face a mask of tortured disbelief, standing just a few feet away. His scent, cedar, rain, and a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline washed over her, threatening to breach the icy walls she had spent 7 years building. Octavia, he breathed, the name sounding like a prayer and a jagged glass shards all at once. You're alive. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward the grand entrance. Laurie, please. Bring them in. The heavy doors creaked open once more. A hush deeper than the first fell over the assembly as Octavia's sister appeared, holding the hands of 2 small children. The twins walked with a confidence that mirrored their mother's, their heads held high as they navigated the sea of strangers. Nilo, quiet and observant, scanned the room with a suspicious intensity, his small hand tightening around his sister's. But Cora was already moving. Her eyes, the exact metallic silver as the king's, lit up with the curiosity that was her hallmark. She let go of Laurie's hand and drifted toward the center of the circle, her gaze fixing on the tall, golden man standing frozen before her mother. The court held its collective breath. The resemblance was undeniable, devastatingly so. Nilo and Cora possessed the same high cheekbones, the same defiant tilt of the chin, and most damningly, the unmistakable aura of the royal bloodline. Cora stopped just inches from Lionel's boots. She tilted her head back, squinting up at him with a fearless wonder. The silence was so absolute that the flickering of the overhead chandeliers sounded like a roar.
Nana.
Cora's voice was high and clear, carrying to the furthest corners of the vaulted ceiling. She pointed a small, steady finger at Lionel, whose face had gone deathly pale. Is this him? Is this the man from the pictures? Lionel looked down at the girl, his knees visibly trembling. He seemed to forget the council, his pregnant fiancée, and the hundreds of eyes watching his downfall. He saw only the silver reflected in the child's eyes, his eyes. Cora didn't wait for an answer. She stepped closer, tugging gently on the hem of Lionel's royal tunic. Are you my daddy? The question hit the room like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a frantic, buzzing energy. Lady Emmeline let out a choked, strangled sound from the dais, her face contorting into a mask of pure venom, but no one was looking at her. All eyes were locked on the Alpha King, who had dropped to one managed knee, his large, scarred hand hovering uncertainly near Cora's cheek as the realization of 7 lost years finally broke him. Octavia watched him, her heart a fortress of ice, finally seeing the shock she had imagined 7 years ago. Only now, it was seasoned with the bitter salt of a truth he could no longer escape. The ballroom had become a suffocating cage of whispers, and Octavia slipped through the glass doors into the midnight air of the royal gardens, needing the scent of damp earth to drown out the cloying perfume of the court. She didn't get far before the heavy, rhythmic stride of an alpha crunched against the gravel behind her. A hand, calloused and warm, gripped her upper arm, spinning her around with a force that spoke of a man pushed to the brink of his sanity. Lionel stood before her, his crown forgotten somewhere inside, his dark hair disheveled by the wind. In the moonlight, the silver of his eyes looked like molten metal, burning with a lethal combination of agony and rage. 7 years, Octavia, he rasped, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that shook the very air between them. I spent 7 years mourning a ghost. I spent 2,500 nights imagining your body at the bottom of a ravine or cold in a nameless grave. And all that time, you were raising my blood in the shadows. Octavia didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a frigid stare, though her heart felt like a trapped bird beating against her ribs. You forfeited the right to their childhood the moment you decided your throne was worth more than your wife, Lionel. I didn't steal those years. You threw them away. I never touched her, Lionel roared, the sound echoing off the stone statues of his ancestors. He stepped into her personal space, his towering frame casting a shadow that swallowed her whole. I have never laid a hand on Emmeline in desire. That night, whatever you think you saw, whatever lie you've built this fortress of hate upon, it wasn't the truth. I have been hollow since the day you left. I have lived like a man under a curse, waiting for a woman who refused to come home. I saw you, Lionel, she hissed, the pain of the memory slicing through her composure. I heard you tell her that I was a dead end, that you were merely fond of me. You held her while I carried the life we had begged the gods for. Do not stand here and lie to me when I have the twins' faces to remind me of exactly what you were willing to discard. Lionel's hands moved from her arms to her face, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones with a desperation that bordered on violence. I don't know what you heard, and I don't know how you saw it, but I swear on the moon and the blood in my veins, I have been faithful to a memory. I have wanted no one but you. He leaned down until their foreheads touched, his breath hitching. You took my children, Octavia. You let me believe I was alone in the world while my son and daughter were breathing, laughing, and growing without me. How could you be so cruel? For a second, the conviction in his voice sent a tremor through her foundation. The raw, unshielded grief in his eyes didn't look like the work of a man who had moved on. But then the image of him with Emmeline flashed in her mind, the scent of arousal, the tilt of her head, and Octavia shoved him back, her eyes flashing with a lunar light. The truth doesn't change because you're shouting it, she whispered, turning her back on him. Check your bed, Alpha King. Your fiancé is waiting. Leave me and my children out of your play acting. The palace at night was a labyrinth of shifting tapestries and flickering candlelight, a place where the air felt thick with the weight of ancient secrets. While the court slept, Nilo moved through the shadows of the library wing with the silent, predatory grace of a boy born to an alpha. He was looking for his sister's favorite carved wolf toy, but as he rounded the corner near the king's private study, he froze. The door was ajar, spilling a sliver of amber light onto the rug. Nilo watched as a man stepped out, a man with the same towering frame, the same silver-threaded hair, and the same heavy brow as the king who had knelt before them in the ballroom. But then, the air around the figure began to shimmer and warp like heat rising from sun-baked stone. Nilo's breath hitched as he watched the man's features melt and reform. The silver eyes bled into a muddy, sickly yellow, and the regal jawline softened into something sharper, more rat-like. A second later, a second king stepped out from the darkness of the room, the real Lionel, looking exhausted and weary. The first figure gave a mocking, jagged grin before his body rippled again, shifting back into the perfect, polished likeness of the Alpha King. Nilo scrambled back, his heart drumming against his ribs, and ran until he burst into the guest chambers where Octavia was pacing.
Mama.
There are two of them, Nilo cried, clutching her skirts, his voice trembling with the certainty of a child who had seen a monster. The king, he changed his face. He became a different man with yellow eyes, and then he became the king again. Octavia knelt, pulling Nilo into her arms, but her eyes went to Lori, who stood by the window. Nilo, honey, you're tired, Lori whispered, stepping forward to stroke his hair. The palace is old and full of shadows. Your mind is playing tricks because of the stress. It wasn't a shadow, Nilo insisted, his eyes wide and bright with unshed tears. He melted, Mama. He melted like a candle. Lori sighed, giving Octavia a sympathetic look. He's been through so much today. The shock of meeting Lionel, the crowd, it's just a nightmare walking, Octavia. But Octavia didn't pull away. She held Nilo's trembling shoulders, her mind racing back to the night she had fled. She remembered the scent of the room, how it had been cedar and rain, but also something cloying and artificial. She remembered how Lionel had sounded slightly off, his words more cruel than the man she knew. She looked at her son, seeing the raw honesty in his silver gaze. Children of the blood didn't hallucinate shape-shifting, they sensed the uncanny. If Nilo was right, if there was someone in this palace who could wear Lionel's face like a mask, then the betrayal she had carried for 7 years might not have been a betrayal at all. It might have been a masterpiece of deception. A cold, calculated frame designed to drive the barren queen away so a changeling could take her place. Octavia looked toward the locked door, her grief suddenly sharpening into a cold, lethal suspicion. She wasn't just here for the truth anymore. She was here to find the monster hiding in her husband's skin. The morning of the royal hunt arrived with a deceptive golden clarity, the air crisp and filled with the frantic baying of hounds. Octavia kept the twins close, her eyes scanning the trioline for any sign of the shimmering air Nilo had described. She could feel Lionel's presence a few yards away, a silent, brooding sentinel whose gaze drifted toward her more often than the game they were meant to flush. But the palace was a place of 1,000 distractions, and when a sudden, unnatural fog rolled through the valley, the world turned into a gray, sightless void. In the confusion of the mist, Octavia felt a sudden, sharp jerk at her side. "Nilo? Cora," she called out, her voice swallowed by the damp air. Silence answered her. A silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. By the time the fog lifted, the children were gone, and the only thing remaining in the trampled grass was a single, obsidian black feather, the calling card of a changeling. A note appeared in Octavia's private quarters an hour later, delivered by a trembling servant who claimed a guard had handed it to him. The handwriting was elegant, jagged, and unmistakably Emmeline's. It directed her to the abandoned hunting lodge at the edge of the royal territory. When Octavia arrived, she found the twins huddled in a corner, their hands bound with shimmering, magical cords that hummed with a sickly yellow light. Emmeline stood over them, her face no longer the mask of a refined noblewoman. Her skin seemed to twitch, her features losing their stability as Ivor stood behind her, his form fluctuating between a palace guard and his own hollow, rat-like reality. The alpha is starting to look at you with those pathetic, longing eyes again. Emmeline spat, her voice vibrating with a dual-toned resonance.
He suspects.
And I cannot have him unraveling 7 years of work because he's caught the scent of a dead marriage. She slammed a heavy parchment onto the wooden table. Beside it sat a quill tipped with a dark, magical ink. You will sign this, Octavia. A full, detailed confession of your adultery from 7 years ago. You will admit that these bastards are the product of a southern duke's bed and that you fled to hide your shame. I will never sign that lie, Octavia whispered, her eyes fixed on Cora's tear-streaked face. Then they will never leave this lodge. Ivor intervened, his hand shifting into a long, translucent claw that hovered over Nilo's throat. If you sign, I will ensure they are found safe in the woods. If you refuse, I will feed them to the shadows, and Lionel will be told that you killed them yourself in a fit of madness before taking your own life. Octavia looked from the quill to her children. The stakes had moved beyond her pride or her broken heart. She saw the desperation in Emmeline's wavering face and realized the villain's mask wasn't just slipping, it was shattering. Octavia reached for the pen, her hand steady even as her soul screamed. She needed to buy time, and as her fingers brushed the parchment, she felt the low, primal hum of Nilo's blood beginning to boil, a dormant power in the boy that the changelings had foolishly overlooked. The air in the hunting lodge's cellar was thick with the copper tang of old blood and the sour, oily smell of changeling magic. Nilo huddled against Cora, his small frame trembling not with fear, but with a burgeoning, white-hot heat that seemed to radiate from his very marrow. He watched through the floorboards as the monsters threatened his mother, their shadows stretching long and grotesque in the flickering candlelight above. Every time Ivor's voice dropped into that oily, threatening register, a low vibration hummed in Nilo's chest, a sound too deep to be human. "Don't cry, Cora," Nilo whispered, though his own voice was raspy, his throat feeling as though it were being lined with gravel. "I won't let them hurt her. I won't let them touch you." Suddenly, the heat peaked. Nilo's bones began to pop and snap like dry kindling in a furnace. It was a sensation no 7-year-old should endure for another decade, a premature awakening forced by the sheer, primal necessity of protection. He let out a choked gasp as his vision shifted, the world exploding into a spectrum of grays and vibrant, pulsing heat signatures. His skin itched with the violent emergence of fur, and his fingernails sharpened into obsidian points. With a final, muffled yelp of agony and triumph, the boy was gone. In his place stood a small, silver-furred wolf pup, his eyes glowing with the unmistakable, searing light of the Alpha King's lineage. Cora stared in awe, her tears drying as the little wolf nudged her hand, his tail tucked low but his teeth bared in a fierce, protective snarl. Nilo didn't waste time. He moved to the corner of the cellar, his heightened senses zeroing in on a narrow iron grate, a ventilation shaft meant for wood smoke. He began to dig and claw at the rusted metal with a strength that defied his size. The grate gave way, with a screech of tortured iron. Nilo looked back at Cora, giving a short, commanding yip that told her exactly what to do. He scrambled into the dark, cramped vent first, his paws silent on the soot-stained stone. Cora followed, crawling through the narrow passage as Nilo led the way, his silver fur acting as a beacon in the suffocating blackness. He could smell his mother's distress through the vents, a scent like ozone and rain. He pushed forward, his small claws catching on the mortar, driven by a singular, ancient instinct. A wolf did not leave its pack behind, and a son would never let his mother face the monsters alone. The heavy oak doors of the hunting lodge burst inward, shattered not by a shoulder, but by the sheer, concussive force of Alpha King Lionel's command. He stood in the threshold, a silhouette of silver and shadow, his eyes fixed on Octavia, who stood defiantly before the table, the treacherous confession still unsigned. Behind her, the vent cover clattered to the floor, and a small, silver-furred wolf pup led a soot-stained Cora into the room. "Get away from them." Lionel's voice was a low, tectonic rumble that vibrated the very floorboards. Emmeline laughed, a shrill, fractured sound that lacked its usual courtly polish. "You're too late, Lionel. Your Luna has already proven her unfaithfulness. She was going to sign it, weren't you, Octavia?" But the distraction was all Octavia needed. As Emmeline turned her head, Octavia lunged, her fingers curling around the heavy pewter inkwell and hurling it at Ivor. The dark liquid splashed across the changeling's face, and where it touched his skin, the magic hissed. The illusion began to slough off like melting wax. "Lionel, look," Octavia cried, diving toward the children to shield them. The Alpha King charged, but he was met by a mirror image. Ivor, realizing the game was up, threw his entire being into the shift. He grew, his muscles rippling and expanding until a second Lionel stood in the center of the lodge, identical in height, identical in scent, and wearing the same royal tunic. The two alphas collided in a blur of violence, a chaos of silver eyes and bared teeth. "Which one do I kill, Octavia?" Emmeline shrieked, drawing a concealed dagger, her own features flickering dangerously between her human mask and a hollow, gray void. Lionel pinned his double against the stone hearth, his hands locked around the other man's throat. But the imposter was fast, his voice shifting into a perfect replica of Lionel's own. "Octavia, help me. He's the changeling." Octavia didn't hesitate. She didn't look at the faces. She looked at the children. Nilo, still in his small wolf form, was snarling at the man on the right, the one whose scent had a metallic, oily undertone that only a wolf's nose could detect.
"Nilo now,"
Octavia commanded. The pup launched himself, sinking his teeth into the imposter's calf. Ivor let out a high-pitched, inhuman shriek that no wolf or man could produce. As the pain broke his concentration, the glamour shattered completely. The kingly form dissolved into a gaunt, yellow-eyed creature with translucent skin. Lionel's face went deathly pale as he looked down at the monster that had been wearing his skin. The depth of the conspiracy, the years of whispers, the night in the bedroom, the stolen decade, all of it clicked into place with a sickening finality. He wasn't just fighting a rival, he was fighting a lie that had destroyed his life. With a roar of primal fury, he threw the creature aside and turned to Octavia, the two of them standing shoulder to shoulder as the true hunt finally began. The iron chains of the changeling conspiracy lay shattered on the floor of the lodge, mirroring the destruction of the lies that had defined Octavia's life for 7 years. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the northern sky in hues of gold and violet, the true Alpha King stood before his queen. Lionel didn't reach for his crown or his sword. He reached for Octavia's hands, his touch trembling with a raw, unshielded reverence. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice thick with the weight of the years they had lost. "I looked for you until the trails went cold, and the council demanded I declare you dead. I never stopped loving the ghost of the woman I thought had abandoned me." Octavia looked into his silver eyes, seeing the same soul that had once promised her forever, a soul that had been just as haunted and manipulated as her own. The scent of cedar and rain was pure now, stripped of the cloying musk of the changeling's illusions. In the quiet of the morning, the wall of ice around her heart didn't just crack, it dissolved. She realized then that his love hadn't failed her, it had been stolen from them both. Outside, the pack had gathered, drawn by the primal roar of the king's victory. Lionel stepped onto the lodge's porch, Octavia at his side, and the twins flanking them. Nilo, now back in his human form but wearing a new, quiet pride, held Cora's hand. Lionel placed a heavy, protective palm on Nilo's shoulder and looked out at his people, the same court that had once branded Octavia, barren, and broken. "Behold your Luna," Lionel's voice rang out, a command that brooked no dissent. "And behold the heirs of the northern throne." The queen was never lacking. It was our sight that was clouded by shadows. A deafening howl rose from the forest, a collective salute from the pack that shook the very leaves on the trees. One by one, the high-ranking members of the council dropped to one knee, bowing their heads in a public act of contrition to the woman they had dared to dismiss. Octavia felt the shift in the atmosphere, a surge of belonging that she hadn't felt in a decade. Lionel turned to her, the light of the new dawn reflecting in his eyes. He leaned in, his lips brushing her forehead in a silent vow. 7 years were stolen, Octavia. I will spend the next 70 making up for every second. Octavia leaned into him, letting the warmth of his body anchor her to this new reality. The twins were safe, the monsters were gone, and the barren queen had returned not just with heirs, but with the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the pack continued to celebrate, she finally let go of the past, stepping into the light of a future that was no longer a secret, but a kingdom reborn.